Imagine a world where land was hell and the ocean was your safest refuge. Not because the sea was peaceful, but because everything on land wanted you dead. Over 250 million years ago, Earth entered the most chaotic period in its history, the Late Permian, also called the Age of Death. Global temperatures soared to 95 degrees, forests withered, and the supercontinent Pangaea turned into a bone-dry wasteland where survival was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the skies were empty. No birds, no flying dinosaurs, just a thinning atmosphere, collapsing oxygen levels, and UV radiation spiking 50-fold. On land, the top predators weren't dinosaurs. They were saber-toothed monsters, built like bears, fast as tigers, with 6-inch serrated fangs and skulls made for crushing prey. Some could inject venom, the first animals in history to evolve poison glands. But in the oceans? Despite being twice the size of the modern Pacific, the seas were oddly calm. No giant sharks, no marine reptiles, no underwater nightmares. Just small fish, ancient mollusks, and an eerie silence. This was the only time in Earth's history when if you had to choose between diving into the ocean or running for the hills, your best chance at survival was to swim. There's this unspoken rule in nature. The ocean is always way scarier than land, right? Just look around today, or even back in the age of dinosaurs. You've got underwater monsters that make a T-Rex look like a teddy bear. But believe it or not, there was a rare moment in Earth's history when it was actually safer in the water than on land. I'm talking way before the dinosaurs, back in the Lingian Epoch, also known as the Late Perian or the Lingian. That might not ring any bells, but stick with me. This was a wild, weird time frame. We're talking roughly 259 million years ago. Definitely not your everyday history lesson. Back then, the world looked nothing like it does now. Imagine a supercontinent called Pangaea, that big landmass where Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and parts of Europe were all smooshed together. Most land was locked up in this massive geographic mashup. If you wanted to find land that wasn't connected to Pangaea, you'd have to go way east, to what would become Siberia, Kazakhstan, and northern China. Southwards, you'd find another island made up of South China and parts of Southeast Asia, and even Turkey, Iran, and Tibet were their own islands. But the real star of the show was the ocean. Panthalassa, the super-ocean, stretched farther than our current Pacific by more than double, covering over 60% of Earth's surface. Just the mind imagery of that, an ocean twice the size of the Pacific, gives you goosebumps. And yet, despite its massive size, the ocean life then was not exactly terror-filled. Sharks existed. They emerged around 200 million years earlier. But the massive, fearsome helicoprion with its bizarre circular saw jaw had already died out by the Lingian. So the seas were populated by much smaller, relatively harmless sharks. The biggest among them was Helicotis, roughly 2 meters, or about 6.5 feet, long, comparable to a modern leopard shark. Its teeth were made for soft prey like squid, so not exactly your worst nightmare. Other sharks, like sphenacanthids and hybodonts, were even smaller, hovering around 1 meter, 3.3 feet. Their teeth didn't belong to any colossal bone-crushing predators. There were also euids, sea scorpion arthropods, but those guys were dwindling fast. They'd never recovered from earlier extinction blows in the Devonian, and by the Lingian they were barely hanging on. Trilobites, ammonoids, and some other seaborne creatures still existed, but they were mostly small, sparse, and far from dominant. A few million years earlier, during the Capetanian mass extinction, marine life got hit hard, actually harder than during the famous KT or the Triassic-Jurassic event. So turn your gaze to the seas, and you've got a vibe that's unusually calm. But land? That was a totally different story. The Capetanian extinction didn't just hit the seas. Terrestrial life got clobbered too. But the land bounced back, and it bounced back strong, fiercer than ever. With the old rulers, the Dinosophalians, gone, a new group rose up, the Gorgonopsids. These beasts were named after the Gorgons of Greek myth because their fossil remains terrified the scientists who uncovered them in the late 19th century. Think long, narrow skull, dagger-like incisors, huge saber teeth. They were basically prehistoric saber-toothed predators, but they weren't cats or even mammals. They were Theropsids, the distant cousins of mammals. Early on, Gorgonopsids were small, no larger than a human foot. They were hunting little prey, reptiles, thops, tiny stuff. But as time went on, they got bigger and more menacing. Then came the top predator of all, Inostrancevia. This guy was a total beast. Inostrancevia had range, too, Africa, Asia, and European Russia. And it thrived in different environments, from warm floodplains in South Africa to frigid, air-dry deserts in Russia. Some paleontologists think it might have had fur to adapt to those cold regions, though we aren't 100% sure. Land wasn't only dominated by Inostrancevia, there was an entire lineup of other Gorgonopsids. In Russia, species like Prosavleva and medium-sized Suogorgon shared the ecosystems. But a whole different crew existed down in South Africa, the robust Rubigia subfamily. Rubigia? These were chunky, dangerous predators with dense skulls, powerful bites, and serrated teeth arguably even sharper than Inostranczevia's. One hot example, Rubidia atrox, around 10 feet, 3 meters long, with a skull making up over 15% of its body length. Its skull was thick, with bony bosses, built for grappling and biting large prey, and yet, its bite force? Reconstructed at around 715 newtons, only about 20% stronger than a wolf. In other words, nature relied on design, not raw strength. There were probably dozens of Gorgonopsid species, some of them as large as Inostrancevia, living alongside Rubigia, especially in South Africa, where they might have shared hunting territories and fought for dominance. But just when you thought Gorgonopsids had the monopoly on terror, land in the late Permian throws another curveball, the Theosophalians. These guys, also known as beast heads, were therapsids too, distant cousins to both Gorgonopsids and early mammals. They weren't as large or iconic, but they were just as deadly, and a whole lot more diverse. While Gorgonopsids had a handful of dominant species, Theosophalians were popping up all over the place. Russia, Antarctica, Africa, China, you name it. Most of them were predators, although a few oddballs were herbivores. Some of them looked a lot like their Gorgonopsid rivals, big heads, strong bodies, sharp teeth, but they had their own unique features. Theosophalians tended to be more compact, with shorter bodies, smaller but straighter teeth, and deeper, broader skulls. Their builds were sturdy, their styles, creative. Some Theosophalians might have even been venomous. Yeah, venomous. Two genera in particular, Ichibops and Eucarissa, were about the size of dogs and had skull structures that hint at venom ducts. If that's true, they'd be the first known tetrapods to evolve venom. Let that sink in. Millions of years before snakes, there were venom-spitting proto-mammals skulking through Permian underbrush. Then you had the weirdos, like Ictiodosuchoidea, who might have been semi-aquatic, or Silacosaurids, another subgroup with terrifying saber teeth, just used in slightly different ways. Some of these predators hunted more like crocodiles, some like wolves, some like nothing we've ever seen. But the standout among all Theosophalians? That title goes to Moscorhinus. Picture a predator the size of a jaguar, but with a lion-sized skull. It had strong, conical teeth, razor-sharp. Its limbs were powerful, perfect for tackling prey before it tore them up with that massive jaw. And according to fossil records, Moscorhinus wasn't just around, it was everywhere. This thing was one of the most widespread and abundant Theosophalians of the entire late Permian. Some researchers even think Moscorhinus reached apex predator status in certain environments, outcompeting the Gorgonopsids. And that's a huge deal, because it means that even on land already crawling with saber-toothed killers, there were still rival predators finding ways to dominate. But wait, there were even bigger Theosophalians. Meet Megahoitzia, the biggest Theosophalian ever discovered. It prowled through European Russia during the first half of the Lingian and reached a whopping 3 meters, about 9 feet, in length. Based on fossilized feces, yep, coprolites, we know it hunted large prey like diadectids. And here's the kicker. There's some evidence that it too might have been venomous. Certain skull features suggest venom glands and ducts, designed to inject fatal doses during a bite. That said, not all paleontologists are sold on that theory, especially since its prey remains tend to be heavily degraded, making it tough to confirm. So now, imagine this world: Gorgonopsids the size of bears, venomous Theosophalians, carnivores evolving strange hunting strategies, all of them prowling across an Earth that was blisteringly hot and ecologically unstable. But we're not done yet. The late Permian had a whole other wave of carnivores that didn't fit into the Gorgonopsid or Theosophalian boxes. For example, there were the proto-mammals, reptiles that looked kind of like slim crocodiles, equipped with long, needly teeth. These predators ranged in size and habitat, from full-time landstalkers to semi-aquatic ambush hunters. They weren't quite dinosaurs, but they were definitely a step closer to them than the other Permian predators. Then there were the Gorgonopsids, again, croc-like creatures, but this time with serious armor plating along their backs. Think mini tanks that could survive in harsh conditions. Some of them were fully terrestrial, others were tied to river systems. They weren't always large, many were lizard-sized, but some genera, like eerily, could get as big as modern alligators, and lurking around ponds, lakes, and swampy edges, amphibians. But not your garden variety frogs. No, these were temnospondyls and other primitive tetrapods, basically the grandfathers of modern amphibians. And they weren't pushovers. One group, the Rhinsuchidae, had long tails, 4 limbs, and bodies like a mix between a crocodile and a salamander. The largest species, Uranocentrodon, could reach 10 feet, 3 meters long. These amphibians were ambush predators, lying in wait for anything that got too close to fresh water. Now you might be thinking, with all these killers running around, how did herbivores even survive? Great question. Surprisingly, herbivores in the late Permian were not only surviving, but thriving. They were more diverse than the predators, and they evolved some incredible defenses. One of the most successful was the Lystrosaurus, a stocky little dicynodont the size of a pig. This guy was everywhere. Its fossils have been found in South Africa, India, even Antarctica. It was built like a bulldozer and could dig burrows to avoid the heat or escape predators. It didn't look like much, but it would go on to dominate after the Permian extinction. Then you had the armored crew, pariasaurs. These were giant lumbering herbivores with bony plates embedded in their skin, kind of like an ankylosaurus, minus the tail club. The biggest of them all? Scutosaurus. This thing weighed over a ton and was as long as the largest Gorgonopsids. Its bones were dense and heavy, perfect for absorbing bites and slashes from predators. It couldn't run, but it didn't need to. It was a walking fortress, and above all this chaos, nothing. No flying giants, no terrifying pterosaurs. The skies were pretty quiet. There were some large insects, dragonfly-like creatures from the Carboniferous hangover, but they weren't dangerous. That's one thing the Permian didn't do: sky monsters. The real danger was on the ground. Let's zoom out for a second. We've just spent time with saber-toothed beasts, venomous proto-mammals, and armored giants, spread out across lands that today would be Europe, Russia, South Africa, and China. But here's the twist. Despite how dominant life was in these areas, huge portions of the Earth were basically uninhabitable. The late Permian was brutal. The average global temperature? Around 35 degrees, that's 95 degrees, and that was just the average. Near the equator, things got worse. Intense heat baked the land, and severe dryness sucked the life out of everything. Massive deserts spread across Pangaea, especially near the tropics, creating vast zones that were nearly lifeless. And to the north? That's where things really went to hell. Northern Pangaea was turning into a full-blown apocalyptic wasteland, all thanks to one of the most devastating natural disasters Earth has ever faced, the Great Dying. Also known as the Permian Triassic extinction event, this was the single worst mass extinction in our planet's history. Even the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs couldn't compete with this one, and while there are multiple theories on what exactly caused it, the leading candidate is something called the Siberian traps. Now, don't let the name fool you. It's not some ancient Russian booby trap. The Siberian traps are a massive region of volcanic rock in what's now Siberia, roughly the size of Western Europe. Around 252 million years ago, enormous volcanic eruptions began here, and they didn't stop for thousands of years. These weren't your run-of-the-mill eruptions either. We're talking enough lava, gas, and ash to completely transform the atmosphere and kill off most life. Carbon dioxide flooded the skies, creating a hellish greenhouse effect. Oxygen levels plummeted, especially in the oceans, causing widespread hypoxia, a fancy term for not enough oxygen to stay alive. To make matters worse, some studies suggest the ozone layer took a hit too. The result? UV radiation levels may have spiked by over 5,000% in some places. If that's true, life on land was getting fried from above and suffocated from below. By the time it was over, the Earth was a very different place. Around 57% of all biological families, gone. More than 90% of marine species, extinct. Roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species, wiped out. Whole ecosystems collapsed. Food chains broke. Forests withered. Oceans became toxic. And even the survivors weren't guaranteed much hope. The aftermath was just as harsh. So what does all this mean? It means that for a brief window in Earth's history, the very end of the Permian, it was actually safer in the ocean than on land. That's right. The water, usually the place of lurking leviathans, became a relative safe haven. Not because it was teeming with friendly dolphins or coral reefs, but because everything else had it worse. Land was chaos. If you were a plant, the UV was burning you up. If you were an animal, you were dodging Gorgonopsids, venomous Theosophalians, and extreme heat waves. And even if you made it through all that, you still had to survive the oxygen drop, the mass extinctions, and the collapse of the food web. There were no flying dinosaurs to escape into the sky. There were no forests left to hide in. Just predators, dust, and death. Meanwhile, the oceans, though hit hard, had fewer threats. The scary helicoprians were already gone. Giant sea scorpions were nearly extinct. The sharks were small. The invertebrates were sparse. There were no marine reptiles yet, no ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs. So if you were a trilobite or a small ammonoid, your odds weren't good, but they were still better than whatever nightmare was unfolding on dry land. It is one of the few, possibly the only times in Earth's history when a swim in the sea was the safest bet for survival, and that's what makes this moment so unique. In every other era, from the Cambrian explosion to the modern day, water has almost always been the deadlier domain. From massive squid and megalodons to jellyfish swarms and crushing pressure in the deep, the ocean is a gauntlet. But during the late Permian, the rules flipped. The seas became the silent survivors. The land turned into a gauntlet of extinction. So next time you're walking along the beach and staring out at the vast blue horizon, remember, there was once a time, hundreds of millions of years ago, when that ocean was the better place to be, safer, quieter, and just a little less monstrous. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Onyx Zoo.